Guilty, guilty. Man, I ain't about to read all these shits, man. How you get caught lacking 34 times, bro? 34 times? Yo, guilty verdict's old enough to have a midlife crisis. Don't look at the audience. They don't like you either. Stop it. Stop it. I ain't even know you could commit this many crimes at once, bro. What do you gotta say for yourself? Y'all remember Kofefe? Get this motherfucker to a jail cell!
Oh yeah, I'm gonna fuck this guy up. He doesn't even know what's coming.
What the? Gary, here, turn me around. Gary, I don't know what to do!
I'm not a doctor, but I think I might be able to help. My diagnosis is that no one has been treating you well.
I don't know, Cicely. I fear my children may not make it till winter. Robert died of the plague, and Sir Leviathan keeps calling me a witch. Witch! Busted it down, Cicely. We need suitors by winter. Show those ankles! Show those ankles! Hey, Leviathan, do you like these ankles? Witch! Ladies, look. I'm a witch. Good thing Sir Leviathan isn't here. Witch! 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 Witch!
For a man in uniform to carry home that Nicky soldier. But he should have been a rock star. But he didn't have the money for a guitar. He should have been a politician. But he never had a brother.
My name's Charlie,
Whoa!
and well, I run this hotel with my partner. Yeah, well,
blood,
someone.
bitch.
And
Whoa!
wait, let me start over.
We don't give a shit about some hotel. Leave before I eat those big ass eyes.
We need your help. With your assistance, we
Get
can
up.
make.
Let's talk about quite possibly the most bizarre episode of Doctor Who ever made, 73 Yards. Again, these are just my first impressions. I only watched this episode about an hour ago, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around what I just watched. And I think we need to talk about just how far this episode leans into the fantasy genre, even more than the Devil's Court in my opinion. This is the first episode where I felt that Doctor Who has tapped into something genuinely supernatural, and it is so terrifying. It honestly kind of reminds me of like an Ari Aster movie like Hereditary or Beau is Afraid, the way that it is so deeply metaphorical, yet also leans so heavily into horror. Because if you're going into this episode expecting a normal episode of Doctor Who, you're going to be very disappointed. It is definitely not that. It is super experimental. It's also a Dr. Light episode. He's only in it for the first about 5 minutes and then the last 5 minutes. Very similar to Turn Left. And honestly, if I was to compare it to another episode of Doctor Who, I would compare it to Turn Left. Because just like Turn Left, it kind of explores this alternate timeline, alternate reality where the Doctor is removed from the companion's life and they have to go on living like normal as things kind of fall apart around them. However, it is not a rehash of the same concept because there's this weird, supernatural kind of out of focus old woman making hand signs at Ruby Sunday from exactly 73 yards away from her at all times. A very scary supernatural concept. But as soon as a person actively notices this old lady or goes up to talk to her, she says something and then they turn and look at Ruby and then immediately run away. And so for the first part of this episode where Ruby's kind of experimenting, trying to figure out what's happening in the bar in Wales, immediately after the doctor vanishes, it treats it a lot like a normal episode of Doctor Who would, but then it veers in a completely different direction after a very significant time skip. And then it almost kind of becomes a superhero political thriller, which is not the direction that I was expecting it to take, but honestly, it really worked for me. And you see Ruby kind of almost viewed this old woman following her, scaring everyone in her life away from her, as a kind of superpower towards the end, because only she knows that this prime minister is going to be evil, and only she has the way to stop him. And it ends on such an open, inconclusive note that's very reminiscent of episodes like Midnight, where you're never provided that explanation that usually the Doctor provides about what just happened, why it happened, in the very sci-fi sense. It leaves it on the same note that a lot of experimental horror fantasy stories leave it, where you don't know what the hell just happened, but you are definitely scared. And I think it's going to take a lot of time for Doctor Who fans specifically to kind of get used to this, because again, this is a fantasy angle that the show has never taken before. Usually the episode ends with some sort of explanation, but people who have been reading and consuming fantasy for a long time are very familiar with stuff like this. And as a standalone fantasy episode that really explores the depths of Ruby's abandonment trauma and fear of abandonment, I think it works beautifully. Because with Ruby, she always has this fear of abandonment hanging over her at all time. That's something that she says or does will make people leave her. And this old lady here, who turns out to be Ruby, is a very physical manifestation of her abandonment fear. It reminds me a lot of fairy folklore and fairy tales, where you accidentally mess with a fairy spirit and you have to endure a spiritual and psychological ordeal to kind of break the spell. And I can imagine a lot of fans being almost kind of rightfully turned off by this. I definitely wasn't, because I love fantasy and I've been saying for years that Doctor Who should really lean into fantasy. So this was a very welcome surprise for me, but I understand why this would come across as an incomplete story or disappointing to a lot of people who are used to Doctor Who as a sci-fi. And I'm definitely not going to fault the people who just didn't vibe with this episode, because it really isn't like any other episode of Doctor Who. And if you come to Doctor Who looking for a pretty standard episode of Doctor Who, you're not going to find it here. But that's kind of the beauty of it, in my opinion. It is so open to interpretation in a way that most episodes of Doctor Who really aren't. And people will be debating this episode and talking about it for years, which is as high a compliment as I can give any episode of Doctor Who. I truly do think it is an all-timer. My major critique of this episode, though, is that it should have been longer. It should have had an extended runtime, or at least have been split into two parts, although I can see how that could have kind of messed up the tone. But yeah, with this episode and Boom and The Devil's Cord, this is shaping up to be one of my favorite seasons of Doctor Who of all time. I am loving this. I think it's the exact right direction this show needs to go in. But yeah, I'm really curious to hear what other people have to say about this episode. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Are you still thinking about it and trying to process it? Please let me know.